The coffee grew cold in the mug as Helen studied the photographs scattered across the mahogany table in her studio. Each image told a different story: smiling weddings, hopeful baptisms, graduation ceremonies brimming with promise. But it was the family portraits that made her pause, especially one from 2 months prior, a gray-haired man holding the hand of an 8-year-old girl, both gazing out at the horizon of St. Sebastian Island with an expression she only now recognized as melancholy. Robert Miller and his granddaughter Claire had vanished 3 weeks ago. The phone rang, cutting through the thick silence of the late afternoon. Helen instantly recognized Detective Diaz's raspy voice. "Found anything on the island?" she asked before he could speak. "Nothing official yet, but I need you to come down to the station. There's something in your photos you might not have noticed the first time around." A chill ran down Helen's spine. Her hands, usually steady behind the camera, trembled slightly as she put the photographs away. The golden light streaming through the window of her studio in downtown Chicago suddenly felt cold, almost hostile. An hour later, she sat in a windowless room, the smell of reheated coffee and old paper thick in the air. Diaz, a man in his 50s with deep-set eyes, placed a magnifying glass on the table and pointed to one of the photographs Helen had given the police days after the disappearance. "Did you see this?" He indicated a spot in the trees in the background of the image, where Robert and Claire posed near the island's pier. Helen adjusted the magnifying glass and felt her blood run cold. Among the dark trunks of the pine trees, almost imperceptible in the natural shadows of the forest, was a figure, a human silhouette standing still, observing. "I didn't see that when I developed them," Helen murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "How did I miss that?" "It happens. The human eye sometimes misses details that the camera picks up, especially when we're focused on the foreground." Diaz leaned forward. "Helen, I need you to tell me everything about that day. Every detail, no matter how small." Helen closed her eyes and let memory carry her back to that sunny Saturday. Robert had hired her for a special shoot with Claire. He seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, checking his watch. He said he wanted to capture an important moment, but didn't elaborate. He was acting strange, Helen admitted. He talked about leaving something for Claire, about her needing to remember that day. "I thought it was just sentimental grandfather stuff." "Anything else?" "He brought an antique doll. Said it belonged to Claire's mother, who died in an accident when Claire was a baby. The girl wouldn't let go of the doll, but she seemed scared of it at the same time." Diaz made some notes and then slid a folder across to Helen. "Robert Miller wasn't your average retiree. He worked for 20 years as a civil engineer for a company that built military bases. He left abruptly in 2010, the same year his daughter-in-law died." Helen opened the folder and found documents, old photos, and newspaper clippings. One image showed a younger Robert, smiling alongside other men in military uniforms. The headline was highlighted, "American engineers participate in confidential Pacific Island project." "What kind of project?" Helen asked, though a part of her already feared the answer. "That's classified. But I can tell you Robert knew things certain people would prefer stayed buried." The air in the room felt heavier. Helen felt a pressure in her chest, as if someone were squeezing her lungs. "Do you think someone took them? That it wasn't an accident?" "I think Robert knew he was being followed. And I think that trip to the island wasn't a spontaneous decision." That night Helen couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her apartment seemed to hold secrets. Every creak in the building sounded like approaching footsteps. She mentally revisited every moment of the photo shoot, searching for clues she'd missed. And then she remembered, Robert had asked her to take a specific photo of the doll, alone, against the backdrop of the trees. At the time she'd found the request odd, but now, Helen leaped out of bed and ran to her studio. She found the negatives and examined them under a professional magnifying glass. The doll had something inside, a small bulge in its torso, as if something were sewn within. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Helen hesitated, but answered. "Helen." It was a girl's voice, almost a whisper. "Helen, can you hear me?" Helen's heart leaped. "Claire. Claire. Is that you? Where are you?" I'm scared. The man in the woods. He said he knows you. He has pictures of you." The line went dead. Helen stood frozen, the phone trembling in her hand. It couldn't be. The police had tracked Robert and Claire's cell phones. Both had been off since the day of the disappearance. But the voice, it was unmistakably Claire. The next morning, against Diaz's advice, Helen caught the first ferry to St. Sebastian Island. The sea was rough, and the boat pitched violently between the gray waves. She held tightly to her camera and a small backpack with equipment. If Claire was indeed alive, if there was any chance of finding her, Helen couldn't stand still. The island seemed different under the cloudy sky. The same trees that had served as a backdrop for happy family photos now stood like shadowy sentinels, their branches intertwined to block the sunlight. Helen followed the trail to the exact spot where she had photographed Robert and Claire. Her heart pounding faster with each step. The silence was absolute. Not even the chirping of birds broke the unsettling quiet of the forest. Helen stopped at the exact spot where they had posed and began to take pictures, using the flash to illuminate the shadows between the trees. Through the lens, each trunk, each bush, seemed to hide secrets. It was then that she heard it, a low, almost inaudible sound like a lament. It came from deeper within the woods. Helen hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, catch the next ferry, and never look back. But the image of Claire, an 8-year-old girl, lost and scared, pushed her forward. The sound guided her along a narrow, almost invisible trail among the vegetation. Low branches scratched her face, and the uneven ground caused her to stumble every few steps. The air grew denser, impregnated with a sickly sweet smell, like rotting fruit. After 20 minutes of walking, Helen reached a clearing. In the center, there was a small building, almost completely overtaken by vegetation, a stone hut, with strange symbols carved into its walls, symbols she had seen before in the photographs from Robert's folder. The door was ajar. Helen approached slowly, each step measured and silent. Through the crack, she could see candlelight flickering inside, and voices, low whispers in a language she didn't recognize. She positioned her camera, and through the telephoto lens, managed to see the interior of the hut. There were 5 people dressed in dark robes, sitting in a circle around something on the floor. And in the center of the circle, Claire's doll. Helen almost gasped. The doll was open, its torso ripped, revealing something that gleamed inside, a small electronic device, like a chip or memory drive. One of the hooded men stood up and began to speak. Helen didn't understand the words, but the tone was ceremonial, almost religious. He held a photograph, and Helen immediately recognized her own signature in the bottom right corner. It was one of the photos from the special shoot with Robert and Claire. The man tore the photograph and threw the pieces onto the doll. The others began to hum, a low, hypnotic sound that seemed to vibrate through the stones of the hut and spread through the forest. Helen recoiled, but her foot struck a dry branch. The snap echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. Helen ran. Branches whipped her face. Roots tripped her, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps and voices shouting in a strange tongue. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, and the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. She reached the main trail and continued running toward the pier, where she had left her small rented boat. The sound of the pursuit seemed more distant now, but Helen didn't slow down. It was only when she reached the boat that she allowed herself to look back. The forest was silent again, but she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows between the trees. With trembling hands, Helen started the engine and pulled away from the island as fast as possible. Only when the shore became a small speck on the horizon could she breathe normally again. Back on the mainland, Helen ran straight to the police station. Diaz listened to her in silence, making occasional notes, but his expression remained skeptical. "Helen, you're talking about a cult on St. Sebastian Island." "I saw them, detective. They had Claire's doll, and there was something inside it, a chip or something." "And where are Robert and Claire?" That was the question Helen couldn't answer. She had seen the ceremony, seen the hooded men, but there was no sign of the grandfather and granddaughter. Diaz leaned forward. Helen, I need to tell you something. We checked the phone records. There were no calls to your number last night. Helen's blood ran cold, but I answered. It was Claire, I'm sure. Maybe you dreamed it, or maybe someone is playing games with your mind. That night, Helen locked all the doors and windows of her apartment. She had enlarged some of the photos she had taken in the hut, and studied them obsessively. The symbols on the walls, she had seen similar references in documentaries about apocalyptic cults, groups who believed in sacrifices to avert global catastrophes. What if Robert really knew something dangerous? What if those men believed he needed to be silenced? The phone rang again at 3 in the morning. Helen, Claire's voice, weaker this time. He said said you're part of the story now. Claire, where are you? I can come get you. The doll, you saw what was inside the doll. I did. What is it, Claire? It's the proof of what Grandpa found out, of what they did. Who are they, Claire? The men who built bad things, who made my mother die. The call dropped again, leaving Helen in a deafening silence. The next morning, Helen did something she knew was reckless, but necessary. She returned to the island. This time, she was prepared. She had bought a camera with night vision, and a digital audio recorder. If she was going to document what was happening, she would do it right. The forest was even quieter than before. Helen went straight to the hut, but when she arrived, she found it empty. There were no signs of the previous night's ceremony, not even the melted candles she had seen. But on the ground, half hidden under some leaves, there was an envelope with her name written on it by hand. Inside the envelope, a single photograph, herself, the previous night, watching through the hut's window. The photo had been taken from inside the hut, by someone who was in the ceremonial circle, and on the back of the photo, a message: Devil's Island, midnight. Come alone if you want to see them alive. Helen knew Devil's Island, a tiny rocky speck of land about 2 kilometers offshore, accessible only by boat at low tide. Locally, it was known as a cursed place, where ships wrecked and fishermen disappeared. She had 12 hours to decide. During the day, Helen tried contacting Diaz, but he was on an operation out of state. The other officers at the precinct listened to her story with thinly veiled skepticism. A photographer talking about cults and missing children, basing everything on untraceable phone calls and photographs that could have been staged. At 11 p.m., Helen was on the pier, staring out at the dark ocean. Her camera hung around her neck, a life vest a little too tight around her torso. The rented boat rocked gently in the calm waves. She knew it was a trap. She knew she was risking her life, but the image of Claire, an innocent girl lost amidst forces she couldn't comprehend, pushed her forward. The trip to Devil's Island took 20 minutes. Helen switched off the engine before reaching the shore, and rowed the last few meters, trying to approach silently. The island was little more than a pile of rocks covered in scrub, but she could see a faint light coming from the center. Helen pulled the boat onto the rocky beach, and started to climb. Her hands found purchase on the rough stones, but the uneven terrain forced her to go slowly. With each step, she paused to listen, trying to detect any sound that indicated danger. The light came from a small bonfire at the top of the island. Around the fire, Helen could make out 3 figures. 2 were seated, their heads bowed. The third stood, gazing out towards the sea. Helen approached by crawling, using the low vegetation as cover. When she got close enough, her heart stopped. Robert and Claire were alive. They were bound, but appeared unharmed. Robert lifted his head, and Helen saw that he had seen her too. His eyes widened in panic, and he shook his head vigorously, trying to warn her to stay away, but it was too late. "Welcome, Helen," the voice came from behind her. Helen turned and saw the man who had been standing by the bonfire. He had moved in absolute silence, and was now a few feet away, holding something that gleamed in the moonlight, a gun. You're very persistent. Robert said you would be. Helen stood slowly, her hands raised. What do you want? The same thing we've always wanted. Silence. The man was tall, middle-aged, with visible scars on his face, even in the dim light. Robert worked on a project that should never have existed. He helped build things that could end the world if they fell into the wrong hands, and you think killing him will solve that? We're not going to kill him. We're going to do something far more efficient. The man gestured to the others, who approached carrying a metal box. We're going to erase his memory. And the girls, and now yours too. Helen felt panic seize her body. What kind of technology is this? The kind Robert helped develop. Ironic, isn't it? It was then that Helen realized the horrifying truth of the situation. This wasn't just about silencing Robert, it was about controlling information, about powerful people who would do anything to keep certain secrets buried. Claire's mother, Helen said, the pieces finally falling into place. She didn't die in an accident, did she? The man smiled, a cold, humorless expression. She was asking too many questions, threatened to expose everything if they didn't let Robert out of the project. You killed her. We protected information vital to national security. Claire began to cry, a low, desperate sound that echoed across the rocks. Robert struggled against the ropes binding him, his face contorted with rage and despair. Helen looked around, searching for an escape. They were on a remote island, surrounded by water, facing armed and trained men, but she still had her camera. Slowly, without attracting attention, Helen adjusted her camera settings to continuous shooting mode and increased the flash power. If she was going to die, or worse, have her mind wiped, she would at least try to document everything. You know this won't work forever, Helen said, buying time. More people will ask questions. The police already suspect something. The police have their own orders. Detective Diaz is a good man, but he has a family, and families can be influenced. Helen's blood ran cold. They had threatened Diaz too. It was then she realized this wasn't just a local conspiracy. It was something far bigger, with tentacles that extended into the government, the police force, maybe even the military. Is this what you do? Helen asked. Travel the country silencing anyone who knows too much. We do what's necessary to maintain order. One of the men opened the metal box, revealing a device that looked part medical equipment, part computer. Electrodes, wires, a small screen glowing with incomprehensible numbers and graphs. It's painless, the man said, almost kindly. You'll remember having a relaxing weekend on the island, a retired Robert, enjoying time with his granddaughter, a photographer who had a transformative spiritual experience. You'll all go home different people, but happy ones. Helen looked at Robert and Claire. The fear in their eyes was palpable, but there was something else, a silent determination. Robert was trying to tell her something, moving his lips without making a sound. Helen read his lips. The camera. She understood. Robert wanted her to document everything. Even if they couldn't escape, at least there would be evidence. Helen quickly raised her camera and fired off a burst of flash photos, illuminating the entire scene like a strobe light. The men screamed and shielded their eyes, temporarily blinded by the intense light. Run, Robert shouted. Helen didn't hesitate. She leaped from the rocks into the sea, still clutching the camera. The icy water hit her like a slap, but she managed to keep the camera above her head as she swam frantically toward her boat. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of gunfire. Bullets whizzed past her head, making small explosions in the water around her. Helen reached the boat and hauled herself inside, her soaked clothes weighing her down like lead. With trembling hands, she started the engine and sped away from the island. The shooting stopped, but Helen didn't slow down until she sighted the lights of the mainland coast. Only then did she allow herself to look back. Devil's Island was a dark smudge on the horizon, without a single visible light. Robert and Claire were still there. At the police station, Helen showed the photographs to Diaz, who had returned from his operation. The images were clear: the armed men, the strange equipment, Robert and Claire bound. "This is enough," Diaz said, picking up the phone. "I'll mobilize a rescue team." But when the police operation reached Devil's Island 2 hours later, it was completely empty. There were no signs of a campfire, no trace that anyone had been there recently. "It's impossible," Helen insisted. "They were there. I saw them." "We believe you," Diaz said, but his voice carried a note of doubt. "But whoever those men are, they're professionals. They probably had an evacuation plan." 3 days passed without news. Helen barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. She enlarged each photo, studied every detail, searching for clues that might lead her to Robert and Claire. It was on the 4th morning that her phone rang. "Helen," it was Robert. His voice sounded tired, but relieved. "Helen, it's us, Robert. Are you okay? Where are you?" "We're home. We just got back." Helen couldn't believe it. "How? What happened?" "I don't know how to explain it. After you escaped, they let us go. They said that without you to tell the story, there was no more threat. But, the photos." "What photos?" Helen's blood ran cold. "The photos I took. On the island. You told me to photograph everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Helen," Robert said finally, his voice strangely distant, "I think you must have had a nightmare. Or maybe you imagined things. We had a wonderful weekend on the island. Claire loved the photos you took." Helen hung up the phone and ran to her studio. The photographs were there, the images she had taken on Devil's Island, but when she examined them, she saw only night landscapes, empty rocks, the sea under the moonlight. There were no armed men, there was no Robert and Claire bound, there was no strange equipment. Helen spent hours checking and rechecking, but the conclusion was inevitable: either she had gone mad, or someone had altered her photographs with impossible precision. She tried to contact Diaz, but was informed that he had been transferred to another state. None of the other officers at the station remembered any investigation into Robert Miller and Claire. It was as if the entire experience had been erased from reality. But Helen knew there was something they couldn't erase: her memories. And there was one thing she had done, a survival instinct that might have saved the only real evidence of what had happened. Before leaving for Devil's Island that night, Helen had programmed her camera to automatically back up the photos to a cloud server. It was a feature she rarely used, but she had enabled it as a precaution. With her heart pounding, Helen accessed her online account. The files were there, and when she opened them, she saw the truth in all its terrible clarity: the armed men, Robert and Claire in danger, the equipment that could erase memories. The last photo in the sequence showed something she hadn't noticed at the time: one of the men holding an official document, with the seal of the Brazilian government. Helen printed the photo, and enlarged the document. She could read only a few words before the image quality became unrecognizable, but it was enough. Project Tabula Rasa, authorized by the Internal Security Division, top secret classification. She now knew that Robert and Claire were alive, but their memories had been altered. They genuinely believed they had spent a peaceful weekend on the island. The technology Robert had helped develop had been used against him and his own granddaughter. And Helen was the only person in the world who remembered the truth. She looked at the printed photographs in her hands, evidence of a conspiracy that extended to the highest levels of government. A part of her wanted to burn everything, pretend nothing had happened, return to her quiet life as a wedding and christening photographer. But then she thought of Claire, an 8-year-old girl, who had lost not only her mother but now also the memories of the trauma she had suffered. She thought of Robert, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, and who had now been betrayed by it. Helen put the photos in a sealed envelope, and placed it in a bank safe deposit box. Then she sat down at her computer,
and began to write a detailed account of everything that had happened, from Cardoso's first phone call to her escape from Devil's Island. She didn't know if she would ever have the courage or the opportunity to make the story public, but at least there would be a record, a silent witness to crimes that were never officially committed. 6 months later, Helen received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, herself, sitting in her studio, typing on her computer. The photo had been taken through the window by someone in the building across the street. On the back, a simple message: "We know you remember. Keep shooting weddings." Helen never spoke of Robert, Claire, or Devil's Island again. She continued her life as a photographer, documenting happy moments for other families. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the early morning, she would take the envelope from her safe and look at the photographs that proved not all truths can be erased. And somewhere in the city, Robert played with Claire in the garden, both happy and carefree, unaware that their memories had been rewritten by people who considered oblivion more powerful than the truth. Helen learned to live with the weight of this knowledge, knowing that some shadows never completely disappear. They just hide among the trees, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. The camera always knew more than the eyes could see, and sometimes, that was the only protection left against those who preferred that certain stories never be told.